Hello everyone, I'm Paul and welcome to Gelling Outdoors. Today I thought I'd show you how I sharpen my chainsaws. So let's take a look. So the very first thing that I do when I go to sharpen my saws is I get the bar and chain all cleaned up. I use a rag, wipe up my bar, get all the oil off of it. I use a brush and I clean it all up with the brush. So that's nice and clean. Now this saw has already been cleaned. I just had finished using it, so I had cleaned it up already. If it's really dirty, I also use an air compressor and I spray it down with lots of air to get all the teeth nice and clean. After I've got it all cleaned up, the next thing to do, flip it on its side. And once I've got it on its side, I'll loosen up the bar nuts. And you can see here I've got the chain nice, it's slack from after I had taken the tension when I used it. But what I want to do is I want to tighten that chain right up. Still has a little bit of slack. I want to put it a little bit tighter. So now I have it nice and tight, hard to pull out. I'll readjust it before I use it. Next thing that I do is I want to get the file, the appropriate file to use for my chainsaw. So when you first get the saw, in your manual you'll have the information about the file angle that you're going to sharpen at. In this case it's going to be 30 degrees, and it's going to tell you to hold the file at a 10-degree upward motion. And also here on the depth gauge, you'll come down here on the bottom, it will tell you the depth is 0.65 millimeters or 0.025 inches. So also it will tell you in here, it tells you the actual size of the file. The bar or the chain is a 0.325. The chain that you're going to, or the file that you're going to use is going to be a 3/16. I've got a 3/16 here. Flat file. I also have a guide on it. You can see here it's just a guide that you can use the file alone or you can put it on a guide. I do recommend using the guide when you're sharpening in the shop, and the reason why I do is because you're going to get the most accurate sharpening using the guide. If you're doing it freehand, you're going to be moving a lot more and you're not going to get quite as nice of a sharpening. It's all about the angles. The more you can keep the angles to the original way they are on the chain, the better the sharpening is going to be. The other thing that you need is a flat file. I've got a flat file here. This is going to be used to take down the rakers or the depth gauge. The third thing that you're going to need is going to be a depth gauge tool. And this is what allows you to get the appropriate depth for the when you're bringing down the rakers or the depth gauges. In this case here, it's going to be a 0.65. So I've got multiple ones for different saws, and this is my 0.65 one. So I got all my tools ready to do the sharpening. Next thing to do is put the saw in the vise. I'm going to put it here in the vise. Clamp it down. Now you guys can go out there and get yourself a nice little kit with all these three parts that will come. And I do recommend using this, especially if you're new to sharpening chains. After a while, you'll get really good at it. You'll know where to hold your hands all the time, that you can actually freehand it. You don't need the guide, especially if you're been sharpening for years. A lot of guys are not using the guide. A lot of guys are using one hand. I do recommend using two hands. The better or the more stable you are when you're passing through on the sharpening of each tooth, the better of a job you're going to get. So let's get some sharpening done. I'm going to turn the saw a little bit more this way. I'm going to bring in some light. Now there's a few things to consider when you're sharpening your saw, and that is how much your chain has been used, and if you've actually hit something, or if you're just sharpening because your saw got a little bit dull. In this case here, this chain is in pretty good shape. I'm only sharpening up a little bit because I had used it just a little, and the teeth, I didn't hit anything. It's just a little bit dull. You should sharpen your chain frequently after either a full tank of gas, up to 3 tanks of gas, depending on the type of wood you're using, or if you hit something, or if you're cutting and you have to force the saw, you should be sharpening it, or if you have very fine sawdust and if you start seeing some excessive heat coming off of the bar, that means your chain's probably too dull. So sharpen it up. The more you keep it sharpened, the less work you have to do to sharpen it each time. Okay, so let's get the file onto the saw and get some sharpening done. What I'm going to do is, since I don't need to find the worst tooth on here because I know the chain has just been dulled a little bit, I don't need to find the worst cutter. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mark the tooth here. I'm just going to mark inside the gullet here so that you can actually see that it's been, now you see I blackened it out a little bit. And I'm also going to mark this tooth behind it, or sorry, the tooth in front of it, as the last tooth that I want to sharpen. So I'm going to mark the top of it. Now the next thing I'm going to do, now you also can find on some chains you're going to have 2 right cutters in a row, or you're going to have a colored tie strap here. The tie strap is where the rivets are. So you might have a colored tie strap, or you may have 2 right-hand cutters or 2 left-hand cutters in a row. So you can use that as your starting point as well if you don't have something to mark with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the chain where I like to have it, where I'm most comfortable, and I always want to file at this point when I'm filing. I don't want to file back here, I don't want to file up here, I want to file here all the time because I want consistent pressure at the same location so I get the most accurate angle on here as possible. On the file guide, there's a couple of markings. There's the 30-degree marking here, a 25-degree marking, and again a 35-degree marking. Depending on what type of wood you're using or cutting, basically if you're cutting hardwood and softwood, you usually go around the 30 degrees. If you're cutting only hardwood or frozen wood, you want to go to 25 degrees. If you want to go to 35 degrees, that's usually when you're cutting nice soft green wood. So let's get some sharpening done. I'm going to put my file guide down, and you're going to see here that the line here, the etched marking, lines parallel with my chain. That's the angle I want to maintain. You'll also see here there's a little marking. You maybe see it better on this tooth here, but there's a little marking. That's the 30-degree mark, so that you should be filing in line with that as well. So I've got this lined up. I'm going to put 2 hands on the file. I've got one on the back. Now this particular chain requires a 10-degree slope going upwards. Most of the other ones that I have, you're going to be going straight across at 90 degrees. You're not going to have any dip in the file. So what I'm going to do is nice even strokes, the full file. So I'm just going to stroke across at 10 degrees and bring it back. I'm not going to bring it back with inside because I don't want the file to hit against my tooth that I just sharpened. And also I don't want to go backwards on the file because it damages the file. So again, lined up at 30 degrees. I'm going to push it through. Now I'm not pushing really hard on it, but what I'm doing is a couple things. One, I'm holding it here and it's my backhand. I'm pushing forward, and at the same time I'm pushing towards or inwards towards the cutter. So I'll do one more stroke for 3 strokes. Now the number of strokes obviously depend on how dull your saw is or how damaged it is. The only thing that really matters is that if you do 3 strokes on one tooth, you do 3 strokes all the way around. If you do 10 strokes on one tooth, you do 10 around. Now, if you have a tooth or 2 that are really damaged bad and they require a lot more strokes, then you start at that point. But if they take a lot more strokes that would actually bring all your teeth back really far, I don't bother. I just fix those couple teeth and I'm okay with that. And the rest of the chain, I'll just do maybe 3 or 4 strokes, whatever is required to get it sharp. Cutters that are not as long as the rest of them, it won't hurt too much, But if you get too many of them, then you're going to have a problem with the saw cutting crooked or not cutting properly in some manner or another. So if you look in here now, you can see the tooth is nice and shiny in there. It needs a little touch more just on the bottom, as it has a little bit, but you can see all the black marking is gone. So I've been sharpening in the gullet. That's going to put one more pass. I can see it down on the bottom. I didn't quite catch it all. So I'm just going to do one more pass, and that's good enough there. So now the other thing what will happen is that here on the top plate, you're going to get a little burr every time you sharpen, and that will come into a nice fine point. This particular chain here is a semi-chisel chain. It's a low profile chain, and the big difference between a full chisel and semi-chisel is the way, if you look here on the outside of the cutter, the point here is going to be a lot less severe. I can show you on another chain here. You can see the difference on how the point comes here. Now this one has a little bit too much of a hook in it, but you can see how it comes more to a point. This is a full chisel. This one's a semi chisel. The big difference between a semi chisel and the full chisel is that this semi chisel here chain will not dull as fast. The points on the full chisel chain will dull much quicker. So what you do is have your starting point, then you go to the next tooth, bring it exactly to the same place. Again, line it up with the 30-degree mark, two hands, and pushing forward and inward into the gullet. And I'm using the same weight of stroke that I did on the last tooth. 2. In this case, I'm just doing 3. And you can see a little bit here. It's really hard to see. Maybe if I could bring a little bit more lighting. But there's a little bit of fiber here. I just pulled it off there with my scrunch. But that tooth is nice and sharp now. So what you do is go around the whole chain until you come back to the first one. I won't do that here now on camera. But you do that's the right hand cutters. Then the next thing to do is to take the saw out of the vise. For a lot of people, you can also sharpen it here on the other side as well. But for a lot of people, it's very difficult. They're not as comfortable with, because you're not able to get the same kind of leverage into the chain. So I could easily sharpen from this side on the left-hand cutter. I would just line it up again for the 30, and I can do the same thing from this side. So I don't have to move my saw. But I want to show you that it is much easier for you to move your saw to the other side in your vise. So I'm just going to turn my vise here, loosen it up, and I'm going to turn it on this side. And you should be able to see a little bit better anyways. So now I'm on the left-hand cutters. You can see here, I'll just position myself where I can get at them. So I'm going to go on the left-hand cutter here. Now I'm going to find that one that I started off with. Okay, there's the first tooth there that I had marked. So now I want to do left hand. So I want to come back to that. Once I see this tooth, when I go around, I'm going to go to the left-hand side. I'm going to go around until I come back to that. Again, I'm going to line up with 30 degrees and a nice even stroke. 1. Now you should feel like it's actually filing. I don't know how else to describe it, but you should feel like it's actually taken some material off. If you go through, and I'm just going to push really light here, and you feel like it's just scraping, but it's not actually taking any material off, it's because you have your pressure or your angle changed a little bit differently than what the actual tooth is allowing you to come in at. So you want to put it in again at 30 degrees, 10 degrees down, or to go upwards, so 10 degrees, and then a nice even stroke right through the whole file. And you see how I'm coming here at the back end? That's 35 degrees, but I should be here at the back end at 30 degrees as well. So I want to go here 30, and I want to come down through. So that should be nice and sharp. One more stroke. Now if you have gone through here and you felt like you didn't quite get a nice stroke on it, there's no problem to put another stroke on it. It will sharpen it nice and clean that way. So how many strokes should you actually use? Well, that depends on how dull your chain is. You may only use 1 or 2 strokes. You may use 5 strokes. It all depends. Again, it depends on how much damage has been done to the chain. The key thing is to keep the teeth at a consistent length as much as you can, and that goes for both sides. So you're going to go around the whole chain and do all the left-hand cutters. Once that's all done, the next thing to do is to do the rakers or the depth gauge. And I'm just going to flip my saw onto the other side just for my comfort and easier here to film this. So I'm just going to turn it around again to the other side. It'll be a lot easier for you to see and easier for me to demonstrate. Now don't squeeze too hard on your saw, just make it so that it fits snug inside your vise. You don't want to damage the bar. So the next thing is to do the depth gauges. Now you're not going to do the depth gauges every time you sharpen your saw. You can buy one of those 2-in-1 file systems where you have the file and you have the depth gauge file all in one system. So you always make it pass, so you'll never have to do this part here. You do one type of filing. But this one here, you have to put the depth gauge on, and usually after about 3 good sharpenings, you put the depth gauge on to see if you need to bring down the depth gauges. So this is the depth gauge tool. So I'm going to put it on top of the teeth here, and you can see here, right here is my raker or my depth gauge, and that should be nice and flush. What you're going to do is just give it a stroke or 2, and once if there's nothing hitting, once it's below the level here, that means that depth gauge is fine. Now the depth gauge, if you go down too low, you don't use this tool here, you go down too low, what's going to happen is the saw is going to really grab when you go to cut, and it's going to bog down because it doesn't have enough power, because it's just going to try to pull you right through the wood. On the other hand, if you don't use the tool and you just give it a light touch and it didn't really need, or it needed more, what will happen is that the amount of the cutter, what it does is it allows the cutter to come in behind it, and if the cutter can't come in at a low enough or at a proper depth, what will happen is that it won't take off enough, or it won't bite into the wood enough, so that you will end up with very fine sawdust. So you got to kind of use the tool to get it right. You can use the tool and then give it a little stroke after if you want your saw to be a little more aggressive. But if you're just a beginner on the saw, I don't recommend that. Stick strictly with the tool. It's going to guide you properly. Now the other thing too is when you're going to do the depth gauge here, to protect your tooth on your cutter, is that you put the depth gauge tool like this if you want, and you can also file this way, so that now I'm filing down the depth gauge, but I'm protecting my cutter. But in most cases, that's if you want to bring it down lower than what this here gauge will allow me to do. So that gauge there only allows that depth, but if I want it deeper to protect my teeth or the tooth, I can go like this and I can just give it a stroke, and then I'm just basically rounding it off. Now you don't have to necessarily round it off, but because when you're doing it this way, it's going to flatten it. You can just give it a pass like this just to round it off if you want. So after all your sharpening is done, the next most important thing to do is take your brush or use air and get rid of all the little metal filings. You don't want all those metal filings within your chain. If it gets underneath, it could do some premature damage to your bar guide. So the most important thing is that when you're sharpening it, as I mentioned, is to full stroke on the file. Keep even pressure as much as you can. If you kind of miss a little bit of pressure or it's not quite the same on one tooth, go ahead and give it an extra stroke on it. The important thing again at the end is clean your saw up, the rest of it, so that you're not going to get any premature wear on your bar. Something that I like to point out as well is when you go to replace your chain with a new one, or even if you're buying a backup chain, you may not necessarily buy the exact same type of chain. And what I mean by that, for example, if you have a semi-chisel chain, you may go out and buy a full chisel chain instead, or another type of chain, or it may not be a low kickback chain. So the important thing is that when you buy the chain is that you follow the information that's on the packaging to know how to sharpen it. The only thing that's important is that it's the right chain for your saw. So in this case here, if I was to replace a chain, I would use the packaging information rather than my owner's manual information to sharpen it. And on there you should see something like this. You should see the type of chain that it is. And down below or somewhere on the packaging, you should see the file size to use, the depth gauge or the depth that you should go down for filing your depth gauges, and the degree or the angle that you're sharpening on for your new chain. Follow the new packaging. Don't follow your owner's manual, because that's why they put that information there. That's basically it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, got some information on it. This is how I sharpen my chain most of the time. When I'm out in the field, normally what I do is I bring a whole bunch of chains so I don't have to sharpen out there, but on occasion I do have to sharpen out there. So once again, really appreciate you watching. If you have not subscribed already, please do so by hitting that subscribe button down below. Thanks for watching, and once again, we'll see you next time on Gelling Outdoors.